I'm going to talk about something that may be a bit different from what you're accustomed to hearing over the course of this, over the course of EdPalooza, because I come to this not from an education background, but from a marketing and media background. I created and produced some television shows that you may know, and I've really devoted most of my time now to how education works in terms of capturing kids' imagination and making a real difference. I'm a little red. This particular system is different from Zoom, so I'm learning that every video camera is a bit different. So please excuse me on that. And if it's okay, I'm going to jump over to our presentation, and we're going to call this Our Whole World in Their Hands. You'll understand that in a minute. Now what I got to do is figure out how to turn the page. So you'll excuse the interface. So here's a bit about me. I created and produced Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego for PBS years ago. So some of you may remember that show. I also come up by way of 15 years as a journalist for the New York Times Syndicate in about 100 newspapers. I've written about 20 books or so. I've been a senior executive within public television, but also with some very big media companies. And nowadays, I'm a senior scholar at the University of Pennsylvania, specifically focused on growing up in the 21st century and what that means. So I've been pursuing initially 2 projects, and this is going to be the third. So let me tell you about the 2 that I've been busy with, and we'll go from there. One of them is called Kids on Earth, in which I run around the world and interview kids about their hopes and dreams and their plans for the future and their lives today. And I've been to India and Sweden and Paraguay and lots of other places. Some of the most interesting have actually been in the United States and coal country in eastern Kentucky and on from there. So if you want to take a look at almost 1,000 short videos that are interviews with kids that are free for use in schools and everywhere else, you can go to the Vimeo address. I'll show these at the end as well. And then the main website for that is Kids on Earth. When travel ended, I decided that I needed to keep going. So I started interviewing people all around the world about what school is and what school could be. And so far, we've done about 30 of these 1-hour episodes. Some of these faces may be familiar. In fact, some of them have actually spoken here, which is kind of cool. So again, I'll show you the information a bit later, but why don't we get into what I've been thinking about most recently? And of course, if you have questions, just get my attention, please. So yeah. Okay, we have an extra slide. Let's not worry about that one. So key concepts. This is sort of what I'm learning and what I'm working on. Seems to me that in the 20th century, the whole idea of school and education was to learn the same things in the same ways. Lots of people following standardized education, and some of that continues. But I think the difference is in the 21st century, I think students want, and we as a society want, people to learn different things in different ways. We're generating so much knowledge so quickly now that having any one person know everything that needs to be known is almost impossible. And if it's not impossible now, it will be in a year and a half. This keeps on changing. The other thing that's kind of interesting to me is, although school seems as though it's a very large it occupies a very large amount of time. Really, it's about 20 instructional hours per week, and you'll see why that's important in a minute. And that seems to be true through much of the world. Some places haven't quite caught up to that yet. A few countries have a little more, but 20 instructional hours a week is a good way to think about it. And at least according to the OECD, to Andreas Schleicher's numbers, it seems as though those 20 hours are largely filled with 20th century subjects like science and math and language. One of the things that I find really interesting is the words social studies are never uttered outside school. So when we begin to talk about relevance and usefulness, ideas that are baked into old terminology don't help us. The other reality we have is that there's so much new science that's happening, and so much interest in additional forms of math and thinking about math in different ways, and so much interest about learning about other cultures and languages, that the current curriculum just gets overstuffed. And as it does, we spend very little time talking about any one specific subject or topic within. And as we introduce nanotechnology and artificial intelligence and all of these other big ideas within science, there's just no room for them if you're going to continue to teach biology and all those things. So we have a problem, and I'm going to talk about how we might think about that problem and then maybe how we can solve that problem. Bottom line, if you're a student, this whole system of 20th century education feels pretty weak on meaning. It's not really relevant to my life, and the utility isn't really what it could be. Now, let's talk about learning a little bit. And I'm going to go through these 4 slides quickly, and then we'll loosen up. I learn because I want to learn. I don't learn because you want me to learn. I don't learn because you're being paid to teach me or you're part of a system that teaches me. I will, if you incent me, I will sit up on my back legs. I'll take the biscuit, but don't expect a lot more from me because it's not motivated by me. It's motivated by you. So with that, you have this wonderful idea, this wonderful old-fashioned concept of a student and a teacher working together so the student can learn. I believe that becomes very complicated once you add a lot of education systems on top of it. And one of my favorites is distance learning. I did a little research. It starts in 1929. This is not a good idea, not a new idea. And it also is not something that we've ever found any reason to really rely upon. It always works okay. But every time we return to the student-teacher relationship because it's better, it's more interactive, it's more personal, it's more local. The other thing that I've discovered along the way, and I've been doing a lot of writing about this, is that common knowledge, what you and I and everybody else needs to know. So I'm looking at the list, what Jenny and Suzanne and Deb and Raquel and Kirsten and Jamie all need to know may or may not be the same things I need to know. Standard curriculum kind of becoming an old idea, especially in this era when students have the means and the desire to learn on their own. So I'm wondering whether we ought to be having schools that are just schools. I don't know that we have to specify middle schools and high schools because I think it's a disruptive influence. And we'll talk about that some more. I don't think we need middle schools and high schools. I think we need multi-generational involvement at the community level. And I think we need kids as young as 5 and as old as 18, all in the same well-orchestrated buildings. And we'll talk about that some more too. So we have all these individual learners, and we've got a good earful today. If you'd listen to the Jeb Bush panel or watch the Jeb Bush panel about individual learner, about the idea of broadband everywhere and ubiquitous, ability to connect and all that. Well, I think that leads to people learning individually. It really strengthens that idea in a big way. If I'm going to learn on my own and you're going to learn on your own, we may not be learning the same things. It's just the nature of the medium. We're not all sitting in the same classroom all day hearing the same things. So if I'm learning what I'm curious about, and what I'm curious about results in productive output, reports, that sort of thing, you can assess me on how well I did in putting together those ideas, but I'm not really sure why you're assessing me. I think what you want to do instead, what we all want to do instead, is put together what we've learned in a form of collective learning. So I suspect that we're on the path to creating the largest learning resource in the history of the world that'll make Wikipedia look as old-fashioned as the World Book Encyclopedia is today. And I think we can do this now. I don't think we have to wait. I think that students all over the world, and let's think about 1.5 billion students, probably at least 1 billion of them are equipped to do this, can be doing work that they share with others. This is a huge difference from the 20th century. But we have a problem. And the problem is we don't treat students, people who are younger than 18, with the same rights that we do people who are older, as in people who are over 18. And as a result, rights are always connected to responsibility. So I can have all the rights I want, but if you don't take responsibility to ensure those rights and make sure I can actually do what I need to do, my rights aren't worth much. So we're teaching a very bad lesson by limiting rights. And the top of that peak for me is in the United States, nobody under 18 controls their intellectual property. the parents control it, or the schools control it, or in some cases, the software provider controls it. Last of these slides. I think we're entering an era now where individual agency and clear thinking are the priorities. And within that, I think we're going to need to focus on what matters. And what matters is probably well-being and fitness and food and fairness and the truth. And it probably doesn't weigh as heavily on school subjects the way we're thinking about. So I want to start fresh. Look at this as if we were starting education now, in the 21st century, where artificial intelligence is beginning to creep in and machine learning is beginning to creep in, and a high percentage of students will very soon have connectivity. I'd like to forget about group learning on a massive scale. I don't think that's what teachers are designed for. I don't think what we should be paying teachers to do. I think we should be paying teachers to help students learn, not to teach. And I think we have to forget about current curriculum because I think it's past its prime date. The other recognition, we're all going through this terrible pandemic now, but multiply that by climate change and economic inequality and the fact that so much that the students have now, we've really had to fight hard to get, and we're still not winning. I don't think adults have done a particularly good job with this. So I think we have to prepare kids to do a really good job with this, because we may not have human life on Earth if they don't. So my overarching question is, are we teaching students now what they need to know? And I'm going to jump from here, and let me just stop this for a second, and I'll say hello. So I can see how red I am. I'm sorry about that. Make me a little less red, but that's a little better. So this journey, this path that I've been on, I started out by going out to individual students and interviewing them one-on-one for about a half hour each. And I would do this in a public library in Chile, or in Paraguay, or in Sao Paulo, or in India. And this is what I've been doing for the past 3 years, trying to understand what is life like for a student today? What are they learning? What do they want to learn? And where are they going? And then I would talk to teachers, and I'd find that what they were being asked to teach didn't make any sense in terms of what the students felt they needed. Now, that may not be a new problem. That may be the same problem my dad had in the 1930s, but I suspect it's something different. And the reason I suspect it's something different is because we're in an era now where the ability to learn on one's own and the emphasis on individual responsibility and agency has become so strong and so powerful that we're beginning to see control happening way beyond what was possible in the 20th century. And we're seeing problems that are so gnarly and so huge and so complicated and require so much international cooperation, use the virus as an example, that we really need to think about this with a very different framework. So I figured, well, that's all fine to say. Let me take a look at what that framework could look like. And a lot of this is the result of my talking to kids and talking to teachers and saying, well, how should it be? We don't necessarily have to do things the same way we've always done them. So in this notion, there isn't quite a curriculum. There's a framework, and the framework consists of about 15 different topics, 16 different topics or subjects. But within each of them, you get to learn what you want to learn, and I get to learn what I want to learn. And we come together because there's some things that we want to learn, but in every year in every grade, we come up with sort of a plan. But the good news about planning to learn is that it changes. You can start out by saying, I want to learn how baby sea turtles are born. And by the time you're done, you've looked at jellyfish, you've looked at deep ocean, life in deep oceans, you've looked at ecology, you've looked at ships, you've looked at shipping, and then the international laws that control shipping. And that's a natural process. That's how we all learn, except when we're in school. So I'm thinking that about half the teachers that we have now can probably help with this very specific curriculum that I'll show, or a very specific framework that I'll show you in a minute. And that about a third require a lot of training because we're going to be entering new areas. And then about a third are going to have to be new because we've just never had the idea of teaching a full course every year about my mind. that encompasses human behavior and memory and the possibilities of technology and how brains develop and and brain imaging and all that, all of which now is very much life in the 21st century, again, except in school. So we're seeing bits and pieces of well-being education, but that's not what I mean. I mean really understanding how your mind works, how your body works, how your country is put together. So if this sounds a little bit like the international baccalaureate schools, yeah, there's a touch of that. There's a touch of Sudbury in here. There's a touch of a few other really good ideas in here as well. My only exception to this is I think K through 3 students need to learn how to use 3 important tools. I'd make the distinction between subjects and tools. I think reading is a tool. I think writing is a tool for clear thinking. And I think numeracy is a tool to describe the world, another form of clear thinking. We can talk about that a bit too. And in my grid, every subject has to be relevant, useful, and meaningful to the individual student. So there's no such thing as social studies that nobody really understands what that means or what it encompasses. Students don't do any homework. They don't take any tests. That's not idealistic. It's called focusing. When they are in that school building, they should be working very hard on what they're doing, and then they should stop. The idea here is to make them think for, or help them think for themselves. And to become self-reliant. And the tricky part in speaking with any education audience, education being the industry that contains learning in schools, is that academic learning is only part of the problem, is only part of what they need to learn. They equally need to learn about food, its preparation, where it comes from, how to grow it, how to eat healthy food, fitness, how your body works, how it's put together, how to keep it in good shape, how not to become obese, how not to become to succumb to other issues. And that's every bit as important, maybe even more important long term than learning a specific aspect of language arts. Relationships, curiosity, being outdoors. And this isn't studying outdoors. This is getting outdoors and making sure that schools have a safe environment for kids to be outdoors multiple times a day, because we now have the research, scientific research, that's showing us that if you take a walk or 2 walks or 3 walks in a day, you will learn better. You will be a better writer. You'll be more comfortable. You'll be less anxious, assuming you sleep, which I can't really count as a school subject, although I think a lot of students do. And also community involvement, direct community involvement at a much larger scale than we're doing now. All of that has to balance with academic learning. So I put together a grid, and I will stop talking very soon, I promise. I figured, well, one of the dumb things we do is we have 48-minute periods or 43-minute periods. Nobody in life does that. People work for an hour. So let's assume these are hours, full hours, and let's assume that we have 2 one-hour sessions in the morning and 2 one-hour sessions in the afternoon with some time to eat or exercise or relax or whatever you need to do or study up in between times. So I would begin, and this is just my version of it based upon some research and a lot of around the world conversations. I would begin with my body. We've talked about that a little bit. I think we are going to raise the healthiest generation of human beings ever. It would be good if they were really well educated about that. That's going to include genetics and where I came from. It's going to include keeping fit, but also understanding what happens when you don't. And it's also a push into community and parents because they didn't have this education. So it's up to the students to spread the word and help them understand. My mind is not only how to maintain well-being and all that, but actually how the brain works, how the mind works, what other parts of the body also think. There's now fairly good science that says the brain is not the only organ that we use for thinking. And some of this is behavioral, some of it is psychological, some of it is biological, but we don't have to make those distinctions. The idea is students come into this class at kindergarten and they begin to learn about their mind. And in first grade, they pick projects that are also related to their mind, but maybe a little more sophisticated. And you know by 10th grade, they're going to be taking on some fairly complicated stuff, each individually. So you're going to need a teacher who can teach this subject or help students learn in this subject that's pretty well versed in a lot of new ideas. And then afternoon A, I'll call it my friends, family, and community. So this widens the circle from just me outwards. And then we continue to do that with my country. So this is not geography, although that's part of it. It's cultures, it's rivers, it's photography, it's communicating with people in other parts of their own country. And of course, this isn't just for the US. And then we widen a little more because there are lots of other countries. And I strongly believe that every student in the world should be able to name every country in the world and then point out that in some countries there is more than one culture, and they ought to be able to tell us about that as well. And the next one, I made a mistake. So that is supposed to be something else. I can look it up for you. Wednesday morning, start with food and cooking, and then exploration and discovery. That covers history and science and the unknown, because there's a lot of things we don't know yet. And then I think we need specific coursework about rights, responsibility, and the law, because every student should understand how that world works. Numbers and money gets doubled up for K through 3 students, but basically this is everything from economics to reading trends to understanding equality, economic and otherwise. Language and literacy hopefully is more than one language in the United States. We'll talk about that a little bit. And then we go to storytelling and creativity, which sort of replaces English, or at least part of English. So this is not only telling one another stories, but also hearing and interpreting stories from all over the world in all media. Technology and change allows students to use a maker lab that ought to be in every school in some form, but also deals with the change that's brought about by all the technology and other social issues. And then my life is the very necessary part about how do you figure out how to make money? How do you figure out how to interact with other people and who you are? So that some of this is identity and some of this is relationships. And then from there, if you'll stick with me, we've got 2 1 hours of strength and training. So this is going to be fitness and stretching and all that. And then 4, I'm certainly likely to create some controversy with this, 4 hours that students choose to do what they think is important. And if what they think is important is taking a walk, that's just fine. But I'm rather hoping that they'll do much more than that, and that there'll be a lot to talk about and a lot to celebrate as they learn more and more. So the notion of this is everybody, K through 12, to the greatest extent possible, special needs as well as the general population, as much as possible. People who are in vocational also follow a similar rhythm. So this is what it could be, and probably something like what it should be, as opposed to what we're doing now that, frankly, doesn't work all that well and doesn't produce the kind of results we're hoping for. So just to wrap this up, if the purpose of school is to create or to generate useful, productive members of society and to have them be individually successful, there's a lot of things we need to think about. The biggest of them is we are in the midst of very rapid transformative change. The role of females is becoming much larger and much more powerful than it's ever been before. Kamala, good, right? Other nations are really figuring out how to do this, so we are being left further and further behind. But there are tremendous opportunities and also tremendous issues around the growth of the population in Africa, which will be, I think that and South Asia create half of the new population that we'll be seeing between now and 2050. So a very substantial rise in those groups. That will end up being by far the largest population on Earth, and many of them will go to Europe and many of them will go to the United States, because in both cases, our replenishment is not what it should be. We're not making enough babies. So we're going to need immigrants to be able to operate our economies. There will be tremendous changes in jobs and careers and money and marketplace. You know all that. And in order to make any of this work as an education system, we're going to really have to educate young people for the 21st century. And I don't think we're doing that today. So that's generally what I've been thinking. I seem to get redder every minute. I'm sorry about that, but there we are. So I am happy to, I've just spoken to you for about 20 minutes, and it's a little more of a lecture than it ought to be, particularly with the material I'm talking about. But I am thrilled to answer questions, to be challenged, to consider why I'm wrong, all of that, because learning is all about our doing this together and not by having one person jump in. So if you'd like, please. I see a room chat, but I'm not sure we have much going on there. No. So I'm going to give this a minute, and then I will jump in and start talking a little bit more. Would there be any form of student measurement for student success? So that's from Raquel. It's a good question, and I'm going to go a little deeper to answer it, if that's okay. So the idea of each of us learning the same thing is really easy to measure because we can test it. Here's a list of questions. If I understood this properly, then I should be able to answer the questions at least as well as you can. But if you and I are learning different things, you have to begin by asking me, what do you want to learn? So as I've been writing about this, I used sea turtles as an example, and we just ran through a sequence of my starting out in one place and then every 2 or 3 days learning something more, and as a result, kind of pivoting. And it's the pivoting that I'm using to learn. It's the connections that I'm making between those ideas. Now, if you come in as a teacher and say, all right, let's test you, I have to look at the teacher and go, what are you going to test me on? Are you going to test me on the 3 hours that I spent on sea turtles, or my realization that sea turtles are eating particles that adhere to their food because the chemistry of plastic is what's affecting them? They're not eating plastic directly. They're eating sort of plastic coated food. So are you impressed by the fact that I know that? I read that on the internet. So I don't know how you're going to test me on that. So I then go to the next level. You can't really test me on what I'm learning, but you can evaluate my output. So if I had a learning portfolio of some sort where anytime I felt that I had learned something it's of value, I would write about it. Maybe I would create something, but I might be in the maker lab making something. And then you could look at that and you could say, that's interesting, but you'd have to assess me against a goal. And if every student is setting their own goals, I'm not sure how you evaluate that. You can evaluate whether I'm showing up for school, but I'm not sure that it's possible to evaluate 21st century learning. I think we're in a different era. So we have that. So feel free, Raquel, to jump in and ask away. Samantha's asking, I always encourage my students to be interesting people, to find time to learn and be outside of school. I also want them to be productive members of their family or household. Your curriculum view supports this. Yeah, but school doesn't. So I don't want them to find time to learn and be, to use your words, outside of school. I want that to be the purpose of school. I think that the idea that we're spending vast amounts of money, that we're employing worldwide about 150 million people to do this, that ends up being, I think it's something like 1 in 40, 1 in 50 workers in the United States work in school. That's a tremendous investment. If we're going to do that, it'd be a good idea if the output was shared, if we weren't creating enough new material by asking kids to create homework over and over again and then putting it in a shoebox. Makes no sense. What we're doing doesn't make sense. What we're doing is a 20th century view based upon very old ideas, many of which are no longer relevant. There needs to be a shift. So Samantha says, yes, I agree. I agree to a shift to that model. Good. There's 2 of us. Let's build a school. The challenge here is the status quo, right? That's the place where this ends up being so complicated, because it's so much easier to do nothing than it is to do something. So Jenny says, I think you've captured many of the reasons families choose homeschooling. It also sounds similar to Waldorf and Montessori schools. So there's weird thing, right? I did the counting, and I'm actually working on a manuscript. So if any of you are interested in seeing what I'm writing, it's much more complete. But it shouldn't be 5 or 10 or even 20% of public school students or public and private school students who are being educated this way. There should be 5% who aren't being educated this way, primarily because of parents' religious beliefs or the belief that the collective is going to be much more powerful than the individual. But this should be the way we spend our money to get results that are worthwhile for the 21st century. If we don't, they won't be able to think clearly. They won't have what they need in order to be able to make the decisions about what happens to planet Earth. We're starting to get some more comments. So let me just think you've captured. Raquel says, would the suggested curriculum be customized or adaptable? Should the student show more interest in, say, exploration and discovery and less in numbers? Thank you. That was almost a setup question. The answer is, you'll remember that there are 4 hours of student choice in those 20 hours. If the student wants to study more because they have become very interested in sea turtles, go for it. That's what they're there for. If you need to put together 4 subjects in one day, or 4 flexible hours in one day, and spend all day Thursday working on one particular research project, do it. How do you do it? It's easy. Remember I said the whole school is K-12? You go into a different classroom that has students that aren't the same age as you, because you're not listening to a lecture. You just need access to the teacher and perhaps the supplies that are in the room or whatever. So you don't have to follow the whole path. For convenience and to keep parents and principals and school districts sane, I figured that if there's 12, 13 grades, that everybody would flow through, so that my first period on Monday would be my body, but your first period would be my mind. So everything shuffles up, and that way you only need 2 teachers per subject. There's a whole design on that. So how would you consider, this is from Nate, how do you consider equity as a unifying theme? Where does it fit in? I think it's the absolute. I think that every student begins with equity, but we have to give them some rights in order to be able to do that. We can't dictate how everything works. We have to dictate how some of it works, because it's public money and it's public education, and it's a public school primarily. So every community has certain resources. Every community has certain challenges. Some communities have a lot more challenges than others, and some students really feel the brunt of that. In an ideal world, we spend a ton of money getting everybody's broadband and presumably everybody's devices up to date. And maybe we've even figured out places where they can work, because a lot of students aren't prevented by technology. They're prevented by quiet place to work. If you're going to do that, you will have spent the money. You're not going to improve the community. You will have improved the technology associated with school, which means the community has what it has. How do you fix that? You build a community garden. You make it part of the school. You involve the politicians. You show off for the foundations. You do things at a community level by taking multi-generational interest, business interests, nonprofits, and all that, and work directly with students, and put a lot of the work on the students, particularly the teenagers who thrive when they have something productive to do and don't do well if you put them into classrooms in large numbers. So I think that we build that equity by building it ourselves and by pulling whatever money we can. It's not going to be a solution that's offered nationally or even at a state level. Would you consider eliminating grade levels? And how about if you just, this is all actually from Nate as well. Would you consider eliminating grade levels in your model? How about just proficiency? You move on once you demonstrate it. The problem is you have to assess to get to proficiency. So if I've had a really passionate interest in sea turtles, I have some form of proficiency, but it's probably not on your list. So what do you need me to be able to do that I won't pick up next year or the year after? And I have a feeling it's better to just kind of keep people with grades and same age, but provide everybody with so much flexibility that the individual proficiency isn't really what we're aiming towards. Suzanne asks, I am intrigued by student choice pods. Where does the content come from? Are they given options to choose from? They may not know what they're interested in until they explore. All right, fair enough. So the teacher and there's at least one in every classroom associated with every subject, that person's job is to be filled with ideas, but not to say to the student, do this. Instead, it's to get to know the students well enough so that they can motivate them in a direction and also be first responder when it doesn't work. Because often it's not going to work. That's okay. That's part of learning too, is you go down an alleyway and you go, oh, this is actually kind of boring. It's not really for me. It's interesting for somebody else, but not for me. So the teacher has to be able to catch that and say, yeah, but originally you were interested in Australia. So now you're not interested in Australia. What initially interested you about Australia? I think it's kind of cool that they have kangaroos there, but I already did that. Okay. Isn't it interesting that Australia is kind of a cross between an island and a continent? Like, what is a continent? And why do we have 7? And do you think there's any more underneath the ocean that we're going to discover later once we have global warming and ocean levels go up or down? And the job of the teacher is to get that conversation going so that the kid is doing it on their own. I believe that kids are naturally curious, and I believe that nobody on earth is not interested in anything. So I think you have to give them the opportunity to figure out what they want to learn, but you have to provide them ample opportunity. That's why I think we need a twice-a-year festival, which I'm calling the Common Knowledge Festival, in which lots of students talk about lots of stuff they're learning and lots of stuff they're figuring out. Because when you do that and you have fun with it and you do music and you do events and all that, there's going to be that 8-year-old kid who goes, well, that looks cool. I want to learn more about that. And that's exactly what happened to me as a Cub Scout when I visited. I think I was 8 years old, and we went to the New York Coliseum, which was on Columbus Circle, isn't there anymore. And I saw these people folding up. They were Japanese, and they were folding up little pieces of paper and making birds. And I thought that was the coolest thing ever. That led to a lifelong interest in Japan, not just origami, not just the art of it, but it really turned into something that has been very much a part of my life. So I've been to Japan a number of times. I'm hoping to go back. It opened up the world to me. It was the first country in the world that I was sort of aware of in any meaningful way beyond just collecting stamps. So it's those kinds of small sparks that really make a difference in learning, because I own it as a student. I'm not being given it as a teacher from the teacher. Doesn't mean the teacher's quiet. Doesn't mean the teacher's passive. But the teacher's role is to help the student find it, not to find it and kind of make sure the student learns it and then test. Make sense? So I'm looking for more questions. If there are more questions, I'm just curious how this works. Yes. Okay. I see. All right. I'm learning the interface. Sorry about that. So the other pieces and parts of this that I find fascinating, there's a wonderful book called Teen 2.0 that if you haven't read and you have anything whatsoever to do with teenagers or high school students or middle school students, you need to read. That's where a lot of my interest in rights came from. So if you think about rights, and that becomes critical to any discussion about the future of school, you have to think about, why is it that a kid who is 17 years old, by and large, can't vote, but also can't make their own medical decisions, and also has no recourse if a parent signs a contract that they don't consider fair? They have to do it anyway. They don't have that ability. They don't have freedom of speech. You can't, and they don't particularly have freedom of assembly either, not in a school. Now, I understand the reasons for that, safety, all of that. But it also limits their learning. It limits their ability to participate with others in a free society. So is there a way for a student to be able to vote at age 17? A lot of students are pretty well informed now. The reason why they weren't voting earlier was because they weren't particularly well informed. Now I meet 17-year-olds, 16-year-olds, even 12-year-olds who are far better informed than I am about major issues, who the president ought to be, who their senators ought to be, because their information they're getting is the same information I'm getting. They just have the time to read it. So there's a very different paradigm for them. But if something happens to their body, they are not the people who make the decision about what to do next. I find that on the one hand, I can understand it. On the other hand, if I'm how old, right? If I'm 17, it's really hard for me to get that. So if you want me to be a responsible adult, you have to treat me like a responsible adult. So what does that mean in a school environment? I don't think it means taking all of the kids within a vicinity and saying, you all stay with one another all day long, and whatever sociodrama ends up erupting, well, that's your problem. But outside, they interact with people of all ages. And I don't know that they have those same problems. I mean, we've got major league mental health issues, particularly among teenagers. And we see that reflected in an annual survey of undergraduates, in which we're talking about major depression and 1 in 4 students struggling with being able to function at all for a period of time, really bad. And this is not a uniquely United States thing. This is something that happens in many places around the world, particularly westernized countries. So what do you do about that? I think what you do about that is you stop forcing teenagers to learn things they don't care about and restricting their movements. It doesn't make sense. Let them learn what they are interested in learning and then support them, but do it within a framework so they're not just all running off in every direction, because it's important that we all learn about our bodies. And the reason for that is it costs a lot of money when people screw it up. So where do you take that? Well, we have a public health catastrophe now, and we have half the people in the United States don't want to wear masks. Why not? I suspect a lot of the reason for that is because nobody ever gave them a public health education. So I've been asking doctors, tell me about your public health education. And they're like, we never had a course. I'm like, wait a second. I learned how to be to work within a specific specialty, but public health was never part of the formula. That's terrifying. So how about parents, kids? Nobody learns it. So shouldn't we? Isn't that something that's turning out to be pretty important? We talk about diabetes, and I've now met more than a few 12-year-old girls who are quite overweight, and I ask them, how you doing on diabetes education? Like, we don't know anything about it at all, but I know my blood sugar is high. Is that what diabetes is? That's terrifying. Why? Because if you took all of the money that we spend as a society on diabetes and on heart disease, both of which are largely fixable by proper nutrition, proper diet, fitness, attention, all that, we could pay for every K through 12 teacher in the United States, and we could rebuild all of the schools every 10 years. There's that much money that we are just draining out of the system because we're not helping people understand how to take care of themselves. Crazy. So is there, we got a couple, let's just catch up here a little bit. We don't know what we don't know. Sometimes inquiry and exploration prompts can help stimulate new ideas, of course, but let's do that as a community. Let's do that student to student, not only the people who are next to one another in a school, but also through the internet and through a lot of multicultural activities. So we've got the opportunity to learn from one another on a massive scale. And of course, if we do this crazy giant Wikipedia thing that I'll talk about in a minute, there's a lot more we can do. Is there one recommendation that you would make to state policymakers or state superintendents? There's one in the room, says Raquel, to move towards your suggested curriculum model. Yeah, I think that actually I'm going to marry two suggestions, but they're both pretty simple. The first is, let the teacher do their job. The teachers are well trained. Let them determine what ought to be taught in their classroom, and get off the assessment kick, because you're really not succeeding anyway. The other thing I would do is I would take seriously the idea of maybe we're not doing this right for the 21st century, and maybe we need to convene the tribunal. Maybe we need to pull together a group of people. I'm happy to volunteer to talk about the trends that are very clear for the 21st century and what has disappeared for the 20th. And let's build a new system in the same buildings if we have to, with many of the same teachers if we have to. But let's change the rules, because that's something we're capable of doing. And by the way, Schools are kind of closed right now, or they're open, or what's today? I have to look at my watch to figure out whether the school is open or not. It's a good time to do it, particularly with this nonsense about trying to turn teachers into entertainers who have to put one eye on the people at home and the other eye on the people who are in the classroom. And I mean, we're dealing with a high enough level of chaos that we might want to take a breath. So the two things I would look at are, number one, and I think I'd reverse them. Let's pull together a very small group of people and try this and listen to all the reasons why it won't work, and the status quo is important, and the teachers union, and whatever the other reasons are. So number one, let's put together a plan and let's get some legs under this. And number two, let's dismiss so many of the ideas of 20th century education because they're not producing the results we want. So Nate says, enable innovation zones within states with attached funding. Absolutely. Kansas can, Idaho Mastery Education Network, etc. Let teachers and and leaders propose new models either on their own or with partner providers and run them with, I think you need and run them with support to the community. So here's the thing about school reform and education innovation. It doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is because the next political group can sweep it away, and it's very individual teacher or individual school centric. So you need a plan, and you need to test it and activate it in a big enough way that it can't be just swept away by the next administration or the next new idea. School boards are real tired of hearing this. They're real tired of the next new idea and why it's going to work. We need a fully integrated plan. That plan needs to pull together fitness and exercise and having students prepare food and a community garden so they can actually see the food grow, and choosing their own subjects and having the appropriate technology. It's all of this together. And although my version of it certainly isn't perfect, and it's also relatively new, if everybody comes up with lots and lots of different variations on this, we'll more or less end up with where we are now. So we actually need a unified plan, and we've got to find a way to be able to involve people in it to the greatest extent. But I wonder if we start out and say, well, let's just contribute ideas and we'll come up with the best thing. I think we're going to end up with something that is a patchwork quilt, and we'll all be very disappointed in the result, because that's been the history. So I know that's a little depressing on the one hand, but on the other, you just don't build things quite that collectively. Remember, there are over 50 million students, K-12 in the United States, in the public schools. There are, I think, 100,000 school buildings of various ages. About half of them are over 50 years old. This is connected to a global system as well. We put, $10,000 or more into every student's education. This is a lot of money. It's high stakes. It's a very, it's an industry that has a lot of pieces and parts. But if we don't come up with some sort of a plan that all comes together, and we're talking more like founding the United States probably than we are anything else, it's a big project. But if we don't do it, we fall so far behind that we probably will not be able to support the kind of economy we need, and we're going to just devastate the likes of our social security system and other pieces and parts of the American experience, because we don't have what we need in the next generation of educated students, because we never taught them. They never learned what they needed to know. And that's on us. We have to figure out how to do this more effectively, but we can't do it a little more effectively. We have to do it massively more effectively. We have to do it both top down and bottom up. We've got to enable the teachers. It's a lot of stuff, but all of it really comes from a shift in philosophy. You have to really, really think seriously about, are we teaching the kids the right things, and are we giving them the necessary freedoms to be able to learn? Ask me more questions, please. Do you like this idea? Is the other question. Is this something that could happen? Is this something that should happen? Or is incremental change, regardless of where it ends up, the more appropriate solution? to a very big 21st century problem. How does this impact teacher training? Asks Suzanne. So if you're a science teacher now, my guess is you're very well versed in traditional science curriculum. And you may have some interest, but we have a friend, for example, who's very interested in NASA and space. So you may have somebody who's very interested in weather or climate change, but the likelihood that that person is going to have deep knowledge in molecular biology or in or any of the very sort of faster moving parts of technology enabled science, genetic engineering, for example, is pretty low. So those people absolutely can be trained. We just need, a different kind of professional development subject wise. We need a different form of professional development. And then you have the stuff in the middle that is trainable, but it's just different. So let's use strength and fitness, for example. So I don't think every gym teacher can be a strength and fitness expert. I think people who are professional trainers may be better suited to that. Now, what does my professional trainer know that a gym teacher might not? She actually knows a lot about muscles and how muscles behave. Now, does that mean that every teacher operates? No, but will there be more training necessary in balance, in flexibility, in some of the things that we learn from yoga, from dance? All that can be trained in. They're not new subjects necessarily. They're an expansion of what the teachers. So I think that's the middle group. And then you have my country, which is so cross-disciplinary that you can't really make it work from we have the teacher we need. So if it's a social studies teacher, they may know a lot about world history, but they may not, and they may know a lot about US history, but the stories that they're working with are old stories. So Columbus Day, Thanksgiving Day, all of that American mythology doesn't really fit into a 21st century framework of multiculturalism and everybody has rights and all of that. So there's very little women's history. There's some, but not much. So if you're going to teach about my country or encourage people to learn about my country, you actually need to learn a lot about the issues that caused us to have women's suffrage, the issues that caused us to expand and do manifest destiny and kill the natives. And it's a fairly complicated story, but you also need the geology. You need to understand how America or how the United States is put together, how the continent is put together, how we've formed how we work with our coastlines, the global warming impact of it, the way the Constitution works. There's so many different pieces and parts that make the United States, the weather patterns, the climate patterns. So that's all new learning. Now, can a current social study, or will a current social studies teacher want to do that? Or it's kind of merging science and social studies and a bunch of other issues. We may need new teachers for that. So long answer to a short question. Other questions? So we got Raquel. Regarding teacher training, I think it could open it up for experts in their field to teach. So maybe we would redefine who is a teacher, and maybe that's someone who goes through a teacher's college and has knowledge of several subjects versus somebody who works at NASA. So here's the thing that's so interesting. Every school is the only institution we've invented so far that exists in every community, maybe besides a fire department. So there's a building and there's people in the building, and by and large, unless there's a basketball game or something, we keep the community out, we keep the students in, and we have big doors to make sure nobody gets shot. We probably can do better than that. So how do you do better than that? Well, every community has a lot of people. That's just the nature of a community. But we don't make much of an effort to connect the kids to the community. It happens in scouting. Scouting's having a rough time, but it happens in Grange. It happens in some institutions, but it doesn't happen the way you need it to. Not where we have a very extensive knowledge of who's in the community and what they are capable of helping the students to learn. So the example I used is a older grandma who knows a lot about racing cars, and she's a great resource. But she's not going to be a great resource for 27 kids every year. She's going to be a great resource for 2. So you have to manage those resources and set up systems so that it's not the school that's running it. It's the students that are politely working with people in the community. But there's so much to be learned by the people who live not only in the local community, but in the online community, whether that's other students who know something, or it's people throughout the world who know something, because now that access is available. So if you're very interested in a very specific topic, you're going to find, so I've been reading about Bach, the composer Bach, and I found a wonderful book called Reinventing Bach. And it opened up all these different avenues to me, but now I'm really curious. The thing is, very little of it exists in the United States. That's not a problem. I send emails, I find people, we get into a conversation. I think that's the way school has to work. And your point about somebody in NASA already has a great schools program. It could be so much better. And every organization like that ought to have some direct links so that kids can not only learn from NASA from prepared materials, but get to know other kids who are like them, who have similar interests. That's where you start building those relationships that build careers and build new ideas. We shouldn't be quite as segregated. We've got to figure out the safety thing. Adults haven't been particularly good at that yet, but we can probably figure it out. And if we do, we end up with a very large community of learning wrapped around every K through 12 student. It's a tremendous advantage. We're not using it. So it looks like Nate is going to nearly close us out. If you have other questions, just pop them in. This reminds me of the Funds of Knowledge research, which is new to me, so thank you, Nate. Each community member can support student learning. Each parent knows valuable knowledge, core of place-based education. Absolutely. But place-based education now is digital as well. So you have this place, and then you have this much larger place. Raquel, I think this was an immensely fascinating session. Thank you, Raquel. Thank you. And I hope you get a sea turtle named after you. Cool. What a sweet thing to say. And Kate just gave me a link that I'm going to take a look at, and everybody else can see it. So we're not going to worry about putting it together. So if you are interested in, I've just finished a first draft like last Friday of about 100 or so pages that kind of takes us through how all the pieces fit together. If you're interested in that, or you feel that somebody who ought to see it, send me your email address. I can put up, give me a second here. I'll go back to playlist and this, and I promised that I would give you this information again. So this is Kids on Earth. I would urge you, particularly at a time when things are very crazy and we can't travel, spend a little bit of time, watch some of these kids. Ignore all the stuff that I did as outreach for teaching India, unless you're particularly interested in India. Scroll down beyond that and you'll see 850 interviews with kids, short segments, all 3, 4, 5, and encourage people to use them in school, because I made it sort of as a gift to the kids of the world. So that's kidsonearth.org, and the video collection is on Vimeo. And then Reinventing School is a weekly series that I host with Steve Hargadon, whose name may be familiar to some of you, who is a leader in EdTech and video conferencing, has been for a long time. And so far, we produced about 30 episodes, each one an hour long, focused on a very specific topic. And some of these faces, I suspect, will be familiar to you. Evan actually spoke at the conference this morning. So there's a lot to work with here. We do a new episode every week. Tomorrow, we have school superintendents from Kansas, Kentucky, Vermont, and Maine. And we'll be talking about some of these ideas, but also some of the challenges. But I like to keep this much more broad and much more, what do we want to do next, not what are the problems today. So I'm hoping some of that optimism rubs off, but that's how to find me. Here's my email address if you'd like. And I thank you all for listening and staying with and all that. And if there's anything I can do to support or provoke or on from there, I am yours. I'm really interested in this, and I devote just about all my time to it. So I'm happy to do that with you, for you, etc. And again, thank you very much.